The stagecoach lurched one final time, its wheels grinding in the coarse red sand, and surrendered to the heat. Ada McCrae gathered her skirts, a film of fine dust already settled on the dark wool, and stepped down into the hammered anvil of Red Rock, Arizona territory. The sun was a physical weight in the year of our Lord 1879. It beat down on the dozen slapdash buildings that clung to the canyon's edge, bleaching the wood to the color of bone. Wind, dry and ceaseless, whispered through the gaps, carrying the scent of grit and hot pine. This was the frontier she had come to capture, the raw material of civilization she meant to document for the illustrated papers back east. Her equipment, a testament to her seriousness, was already being unloaded, a heavy wooden box camera, its brass lens gleaming like a single, unblinking eye, along with the tripod, the portable dark tent, and the clinking crates of glass plates and volatile chemicals. She was a widow, 27 years old, and this expensive, cumbersome craft was to be her new life, a way to frame the world so it made a kind of sense her old one no longer did. The whispers started before her boots were clean of stagecoach dust. A wagon train, bound for Prescott, hit just after dawn. The story, told with grim satisfaction by the men lounging on the porch of the Red Rock Saloon, was a familiar one. Savages. The word was spat like tobacco juice. A settler family, gone, freight scattered. Ada's purpose was to photograph progress, not carnage, but a journalist's instinct, inherited from her late husband, prickled at the edge of her grief. She hired a man with a tired-looking mule to haul her gear to the boarding house, then walked toward the livery. She needed to see the sight. A photograph of the aftermath could serve as a powerful counterpoint to the images of new churches and industrious miners she planned to take. The truth, she believed, was in the details. The attack had happened in a shallow wash a few miles out of town. The wagon lay on its side like a slaughtered beast, its canvas cover ripped and flapping in the wind. Crates were splintered, their contents of flour and tools spilled onto the sand. It was a scene of brutal, chaotic violence. But as Ada walked the perimeter, her eyes trained on the ground, a detail snagged her attention. The hoof prints. They were clear in the damp sand near the wash. They were deep, crescent shapes, made by horses wearing iron shoes. Not just any shoes, either. The calks were pronounced, designed for traction in rough country, the kind the cavalry used. The local dine, the Navajo people who lived in the canyons, rode their ponies unshod or with simple hide coverings. These prints spoke of a farrier's hammer and a military forge. A cold finger of doubt traced its way down her spine. The official story was a simple, brutal one. This detail complicated it, like a smudge on a clean glass plate. The sky, a placid blue all morning, began to curdle in the west. The wind picked up, no longer a whisper but a low moan. The horizon turned a muddy, churning brown, a dust storm. It descended on the wash with the speed of a charging bull, swallowing the light and scouring the air. Ada threw herself behind the overturned wagon, pulling her shawl over her head as the world dissolved into a roaring, stinging chaos of red grit. It was impossible to see, to breathe, to think. When the fury passed, it left behind a world remade, coated in a fresh layer of ochre dust. The silence was absolute, and in that silence, she heard a soft whimper. Ada pushed herself up, shaking the sand from her hair. Near a cluster of rocks, almost swallowed by a fresh drift, lay a small boy. He was dying, his dark hair matted with dust, his cotton shirt torn. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle beneath him. He looked at her with wide, dark eyes, full of pain and fear. She approached slowly, her hands held out, palms open. She knew no Navajo words, only the universal language of a soft voice and gentle gestures. He flinched as she knelt, but did not cry out as she examined his leg. It was not broken, she thought, only a bad sprain. Using a strip torn from her petticoat, she carefully bound his ankle with a cool, wet compress from her canteen. the practiced motions of a woman who had nursed a sick husband. As she finished, a shadow fell over her. She looked up and froze. A man stood there, having appeared from the rocks as silently as the dust had settled. He was Navajo, tall and lean, his face a mask of hard angles and quiet assessment. He wore simple buckskin trousers and a faded blue shirt. His hair was tied back with a leather cord. He was not armed, not in any way that she could see, but his stillness was more unnerving than any weapon. His eyes, dark and intelligent, moved from her, to the boy, and then to the heavy camera case she had managed to drag with her for shelter. "You," he said. The word was not a question. His voice was low, a rumble like distant stones shifting. He walked past her and knelt by the boy, speaking to him in their own tongue, his tone soft and reassuring. The boy answered, his gaze flickering toward Ada. The man listened, then looked back at her. "He says the wind spirit threw him against the rocks." The man said in perfect, unaccented English. "He says the white woman gave him water." "His ankle is hurt," Ada said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I bound it." The man nodded slowly. He tested the binding with gentle fingers. "You have a healer's touch." His gaze then settled on her camera. "What is your purpose with that box? Do you mean to capture the spirit of this land and put it on paper for men in the East to look at?" The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. "I am a photographer," she said, meeting his gaze. "I document what is real. I mean to show people the truth of this place." A flicker of something, maybe humor, maybe contempt, crossed his face. "Truth," he repeated, as if tasting a foreign word. "The white man's truth is a sharp-edged thing. It cuts whatever it touches, without another word." He lifted the boy into his arms as if he weighed nothing and turned to leave. "Wait," Ada called out. "What is your name?" He paused but did not turn. "I am called Talon Nez, and the truth you seek is more dangerous than a dust storm." He then melted back into the rock and scrub, leaving Ada alone with the whispering wind and the heavy weight of her camera. Back in Red Rock, the tension was a thick, foul smoke in the air. The story of the raid had hardened into accepted fact, fueled by whiskey and fear in the saloon. The dying were to blame. Something had to be done. A new group, the Red Rock Vigilantes, was already forming, their authority seemingly endorsed by the town's sheriff, a barrel-chested man named Pike with a perpetual sneer and cold, flat eyes. The next afternoon, as Ada was testing her chemicals in a small shed she had rented to use as a dark room, a commotion erupted down the street. Shouts, then the terrifying crackle of a fire. She grabbed her camera. Her subjects were supposed to be homesteaders and merchants, symbols of order. But this was the reality of Red Rock. This was what needed to be seen. A grain store at the edge of town, belonging to a German immigrant family, was engulfed in flames. Townspeople ran with buckets, their efforts futile against the hungry fire. Through the swirling smoke, Ada saw him, a man on horseback, a red kerchief pulled over his face, watching the blaze with an unnerving calm. He was about to wheel his horse away when Ada saw the brand on his saddle skirt. It was not a rancher's mark. It was a clean, sharp symbol, a crossed pickaxe and shovel, the emblem of the Creed & Company Railroad. Her hands moved with a frantic, practiced speed. She threw the dark cloth over her head, focused the image on the ground glass screen, and slid a prepared wet plate into the holder. The man was turning. She had one chance. She uncapped the lens, counted the seconds in her head. 1, 2, 3, 4, and snapped the cap back on. The image was caught, frozen in silver salts on the glass. The truth, trapped in a box. Before she could even pull the plate holder out, a heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder. "What do you think you're doing, ma'am?" Sheriff Pike's voice was a low growl. His presence blocked the light. "My job, Sheriff," Ada said, trying to keep her voice even. "I am documenting this tragedy." "You're meddling," he snarled. He reached for her camera. "We don't need outsiders making pictures of our business." "This is my property," Ada protested, her hands tightening on the precious wooden box. Pike shoved her aside, with a wrenching crack of wood. He ripped the plate holder from the back of the camera. He slid the glass plate out, its surface still wet and fragile. He held it up to the firelight, his eyes narrowing as the faint negative image resolved. He saw the rider. He saw the saddle. His face darkened. "Just a picture of some smoke," he said, his voice dangerously soft, but his eyes told a different story. He slipped the plate into his coat pocket. "Evidence. Now you listen to me. The next stage out of this town is tomorrow at dawn. You will be on it. If you are not, I will find a reason to put you in a cell so dark you'll forget what the sun looks like. Do you understand me?" He did not wait for an answer. He strode away, leaving Ada with her violated camera and the cold, terrifying certainty that she had photographed something she was never meant to see. He shoved her toward the town's small, windowless jailhouse, a squat stone structure that smelled of sweat and despair, and locked the flimsy door behind her. She sat on the hard cot, her mind racing. The plate was gone. Her proof was in the hands of the one man who would ensure it was never seen. She was trapped. Hours passed. The sounds of the town faded into the night. Sometime after midnight, she heard a faint scratching at the door. Not at the lock, but at the hinge. She moved closer. A piece of rusted wire was being worked into the pin of the top hinge. After a moment of grating, the pin slid upward. Then the same thing happened to the bottom hinge. The door, no longer secured, swung inward a few inches with a low groan. There was no one there, only the empty, moonlit street and the deep shadows between the buildings. From one of those shadows, she thought she saw a flicker of movement, the barest outline of a man's shoulders before he was gone. Ada's heart hammered against her ribs. It was not a rescue. It was a choice. Pike had threatened her. Someone else had given her a way out. She stood in the doorway, the cool night air on her face. She could run. She could take the stagecoach at dawn and forget everything she had seen. Forget the shod hoofprints and the railroad brand and the cold look in the sheriff's eyes. Or she could stay. She could stay and fight for the truth Talon Nez believed was so dangerous. The red dust of Red Rock settled on everything, obscuring, burying. But she had seen through it, for one brief, clear moment, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she could not unsee it. She pulled the broken door shut, stepped into the shadows, and walked. Not toward the stagecoach depot, but toward the faint, guiding light of the blacksmith's forge, a place where a person might find an ally in the dark. The blacksmith's forge was a dark mouth at the far end of the street, exhaling the faint, metallic scent of cold iron. Ada moved toward it, keeping to the deepest pools of shadow, her every nerve alight. Her escape felt unreal, a silent gift from an unseen hand. She did not flatter herself to think it was mercy. It was a move in a game she was only just beginning to understand. Before she reached the wide, splintered doors of the forge, a figure detached itself from the wall of the building next to it. It was Talon Nez. He moved with the same unnerving silence she remembered from the wash, stepping from absolute shadow into the faint moonlight without a single crunch of gravel. "The stagecoach leaves in 3 hours," he said, his voice a low counterpoint to the sighing wind. "It is the safe choice." Ada's heart, which had been hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, steadied. This was the source of her freedom. "It was you," she stated, not a question. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "You gave aid to one of our children. A debt is owed. Now it is paid." "Why?" she asked, her voice a near whisper. "Why not just let the sheriff send me away?" "Because I saw you," he answered, his dark eyes fixed on her face. "I saw you make a picture of the man with the red scarf, and I saw the sheriff take it. You carry a piece of the truth, even if you no longer hold the proof. A person who seeks truth in this place is either a fool or a danger. I need to know which one you are." His words were blunt, stripping away all pretense. He was not offering friendship. He was measuring her, weighing her worth and her risk. I do not know what I am, Ada admitted honestly, but I know what I saw. The hoof prints at the wash, the brand on that saddle, they do not match the story this town is telling. Talon was silent for a long moment, studying her. The moonlight carved his face into stark plains and shadows. The boy I carried from the wash, his name is Little Sparrow. His mother is my cousin. We must return him. Come with me. It was not an invitation. It was a command and a test. To follow him was to turn her back completely on the world she knew, on the safety of the stagecoach, and step into the very wilderness her Eastern patrons paid her to document from a safe distance. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her resolve. But the image of Sheriff Pike's face, the smug certainty in his eyes as he pocketed her glass plate, burned hotter. I will come, she said. He turned without another word, and she followed him. They did not take a main trail, but instead moved toward the looming black wall of the canyon that gave Red Rock its name. Talon found a path that was invisible to Ada's eyes, a narrow fissure in the rock face, barely wider than a man's shoulders. The journey was a descent into the earth. The air grew cool and still, the wind silenced by the towering stone walls. The only sounds were the scuff of their boots on loose rock and their own breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the profound quiet. Talon moved with an economy of motion that was both graceful and predatory. He never slipped, never made a false step. Ada, encumbered by her skirts and city-bred sensibilities, struggled. Her hands were scraped raw from steadying herself against the rough sandstone, and her lungs ached from the thin, cool air. Several times, his hand would appear from the darkness just as her foot was about to slip, his grip firm and impersonal on her elbow, setting her right before releasing her and moving on. He did not offer words of encouragement. He simply expected her to keep up, and she did. With every painful step, she felt a layer of her old self being scraped away, replaced by something harder, more resilient. After what felt like hours, the narrow passage opened into a wider canyon floor, a hidden river of sand protected by the cliffs. Above, a sliver of the sky was visible, dusted with a spray of impossibly bright stars. They walked on, and soon she smelled the scent of burning juniper and heard the low murmur of voices. They had arrived. The camp of the Dine was nothing like the lurid illustrations in the Eastern papers. There were no painted teepees or feathered headdresses. Instead, several low, dome-shaped structures, hogans made of earth and wood, were scattered among the rocks. Small fires glowed like fallen stars, and the quiet sounds of a community settling for the night filled the air. A woman, her silhouette framed by a fire, was grinding corn on a stone meted, the rhythmic scrape and grind a peaceful, domestic sound. A young woman with intelligent, watchful eyes and 2 feathers woven into her long black hair came forward to meet them. She saw the boy in Talon's arms, and her face softened with relief. She took him, speaking to him in the melodic Dine language, her hands moving over his bandaged ankle with a practiced gentleness. This was Lena 2 Feathers. She looked from the boy to Ada, a silent question in her eyes. "This is the woman who found him," Talon said. "She bound his leg." Lena nodded to Ada, a gesture of gratitude that needed no translation. "You have a good heart," she said. Her English as clear as Talon's. It is a rare thing to find in a white person from that town. She led them toward a fire where a few elders sat, wrapped in colorful blankets against the night's chill. As Little Sparrow was reunited with his mother, Ada saw a small gathering of people near the center of the camp. They were not celebrating, but standing in quiet reverence. An older man held his hands up to the sky, his voice a low, rhythmic chant. He was giving thanks. For what? Ada did not know. "For the rain," Talon said, appearing at her side again. A small shower passed through the canyon this evening. It was not enough to fill the cisterns, but it was enough to settle the dust. We give thanks for what we are given, no matter how small. Ada watched the simple ceremony, a stark contrast to the boisterous, often drunken services in the Red Rock Church. Here, there was a deep, quiet connection to the land, a humility she had never witnessed before. She was an intruder, a witness to a private moment, yet no one made her feel unwelcome. They simply allowed her to be there, their dignity a shield against her otherness. She felt a profound sense of dislocation. Everything she thought she knew about this land and its people was wrong. The narrative of progress and savagery was a crude lie, a story told to justify greed. What she was seeing was not a lack of civilization. It was a different kind, one that did not measure its worth in railroads and gold mines. Later, as Lena was applying a poultice of crushed herbs to Little Sparrow's ankle, Ada wandered toward a small rope corral where a few ponies were kept. One, a young colt with a shaggy coat, was favoring its right foreleg. As she drew closer, she saw why. Nailed to its small, delicate hoof was a heavy iron horseshoe. It was a cavalry shoe, identical to the ones whose prints she had found at the wash. It was cruelly large for the colt, and a dark stain around the nails suggested it was causing the animal pain. The sight was so jarring, so utterly out of place, that for a moment she could not make sense of it. Why would a dying colt be shod like a United States Army dragoon's mount? She felt Talon's presence before she saw him. He had been watching her. He followed her gaze to the colt's hoof. The warmth and quietude vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, hard anger. "Where did that horse come from?" Ada asked, her voice low. "It is part of a trade," Talon said, his voice tight. "A man who runs a ranch north of here. A man named Fowler. His business was bought by Creed and Company. Now, he offers the people a good trade. 2 of our healthy, unshod ponies for one of his grain-fed yearlings. It seems like a generous offer to those who are struggling." He knelt, and with a grunt of effort, used a rock to carefully pry the heavy shoe from the colt's hoof. The animal whimpered and pulled back, but Talon held it fast, speaking to it in low, soothing tones. "They give us these," he said, holding up the iron shoe. It was heavy in his hand, a solid piece of forged deceit. Animals already shod in the military style. Then their riders, the men with the red scarves, put on their masks and attacked the wagons, leaving behind the tracks of these very shoes. The world sees the evidence and blames the Navajo. Our ponies, the ones we traded away, they simply disappear. And Silas Creed's railroad gets one step closer to claiming this land as empty and dangerous, in need of his civilizing touch. The pieces clicked into place in Ada's mind, forming a picture of such calculated cruelty that it took her breath away. It was a perfect crime, a lie signed in iron upon the earth. She fumbled in her satchel for a notebook and pencil, her hands trembling. She had to write it down, every detail. The fear was still there, a cold current in her veins, but it was now joined by a fierce, burning anger. She was no longer just a documentarian. She was a witness. She sketched the horseshoe, noting the distinct shape of the calks, the pattern of the nail holes. Talon watched her, his face grim. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of young Army lieutenants who believed they could impose order on a land that refused to be ordered. "Be careful what you write in that book," he warned, his voice low and intense. "Paper burns easier than a grain store. The truth you are chasing, woman, is not a picture you can frame and hang on a wall. Out here, the truth has a price, and that price is paid in blood." He tossed the horseshoe onto the sand, where it landed with a dull, heavy thud. The sound echoed the closing of a cell door. Ada looked down at her notebook, at the furious scribbles that could get her killed. She looked up at Talon, who now stood at the edge of the camp, a solitary guardian watching the darkness beyond the firelight. He had paid his debt to her, and now he had given her a warning. The choice of what to do next was hers alone. The fear remained, but beneath it, her resolve hardened. She would not run. She could not. Ada spent 2 days in the hidden canyon, a ghost living on the edge of a world she had only ever imagined. She filled her notebook with observations. sketching the elegant curve of a yucca plant, the pattern of a woven blanket, the way the light fell across the sandstone at dawn. She learned that the Diné spoke in a language that was as much a part of the landscape as the wind, their voices soft yet resonant. She learned that their poverty, by the standards of the East, was a material one only. In spirit, in community, they were richer than any merchant in Red Rock. It was a fragile peace. An existence lived in the shadow of a threat that had a name and a face and the full backing of the law. On the third day, the weather turned. The sky, usually a vast and indifferent blue, took on a sickly yellow-brown hue. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing down with a suffocating stillness that silenced the birds and insects. An unnatural twilight fell at midday. The Dine looked to the sky with worried eyes, securing their hogans and gathering their children. Talon stood on a high rock, motionless, reading the signs in the curdled clouds that Ada could not comprehend. The storm did not arrive with the bluster of wind or the drama of thunder. It began with a sound, a low, distant roar that grew steadily louder, like 1,000 locomotives approaching at once. Then the first stones fell. They were small, no bigger than pebbles, rattling against the hard-packed earth. Then larger ones, the size of marbles, then walnuts. Within minutes, the air was filled with a fusillade of ice, chunks as big as a man's fist, that fell with murderous force. The world became a cacophony of shattering ice and percussive impacts. The small, carefully tended patches of corn and squash planted near a seep in the canyon wall were shredded in seconds. The green leaves reduced to pulp. A young goat, caught in the open, was struck and fell, its bleeding cut short. Ada huddled with Lena Two Feathers under a thick rock overhang, watching the brutal assault. There was nothing to be done but endure, to witness the sky wage war on the land. The hailstorm lasted for 10 minutes that felt like an eternity and left behind a scene of devastation. The ground was white, as if from a winter snow, but it was a cruel, dead blanket of ice. The scent of bruised sage and shattered pine filled the air. The community emerged, their faces grim, to survey the damage, their meager harvest. The food that would have seen them through the coming months was gone. As the last of the unnatural chill was beginning to leave the air, a thin column of dark smoke began to rise in the distance, staining the bruised yellow sky. It was from the direction of Red Rock. Talon saw it from his perch and was down in the camp in an instant, his face a mask of grim certainty. "It is another fire," he said, his voice low and hard. They did not wait long. "The vigilantes," Ada said, the name leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. "They use the storm as cover," Talon replied, his eyes fixed on the smoke. "When people are afraid of the heavens, they do not notice the devils on the ground. It will be another warehouse, another homesteader's stores. And tomorrow, the talk in the saloon will be about the savage natives, driven by the storm's bad medicine to raid and burn." He needed to see. He needed to know which warehouse, whose livelihood was now being offered up as another piece of false evidence. He looked at Ada. "I am going closer. You should stay here. It is safer." "No," she said, her voice firm. She was already gathering her satchel and the heavy case that held her camera. "I am not a guest here. I am a witness. I am going with you." He studied her for a moment, saw the fear in her eyes warring with a resolve that was as hard as desert rock, and gave a single, sharp nod. They chose a route that followed a series of dry, interconnected ravines, a path that would keep them hidden from the main trails. Their destination was a high bluff that overlooked the town from the west. The air was still thick with dust and the oppressive humidity left by the storm. As they entered a wide, sandy channel known to the locals as Dead Man's Wash, the wind began to stir again. It was not the cool, cleansing breeze that often follows a storm, but a hot, gritty breath that picked up the loose sand and threw it in their faces. The sky darkened once more, not with the green-black of hail, but with a roiling wall of red dust. The second storm of the day was upon them. Talon cursed under his breath and pulled Ada toward the relative shelter of the high, crumbling bank of the wash. They pressed themselves against the earthen wall as the wind howled past, a physical force that threatened to tear them from their footing. The world beyond their small pocket of shelter was a vortex of stinging, blinding grit. And then came the rain. It was not the gentle shower the Dine had given thanks for days earlier. It was a deluge, a solid sheet of water that fell from the sky, turning the dust to instant mud. A flash of lightning lit the chaotic scene, a brilliant, terrifying violet tear in the sky. In that brief, stark illumination, Ada saw the water in the bottom of the wash begin to move, not soaking into the sand, but sliding over its surface, thick with mud. "We have to climb!" Talon yelled over the roar of the wind and rain. "Now!" Before Ada could process his command, she heard it, a sound deeper than the storm, a rumbling, grinding roar that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. It was the sound she had heard just before the hailstorm, but 100 times louder, 1,000 times closer. Talon grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "The flood!" he shouted, his face inches from hers, his eyes wide with urgency. "Run!" He did not wait for her to obey. He half dragged, half threw her toward the steep, muddy bank of the wash. They scrambled upward, their boots slipping in the slick mud, their fingers clawing for purchase on exposed roots and rocks. The roar grew deafening. Ada risked a glance over her shoulder and her blood ran cold. It was not a river, it was a wall, a solid wall of brown water, mud and debris, at least 10 feet high, churning with uprooted trees and broken branches, moving down the wash with the speed of a stampeding herd. It was the entire storm, all the rain that had fallen on the high mesas for miles, now concentrated into a single, unstoppable wave of destruction. The water hit the base of the bank just as they were halfway up. The ground shuddered. The muddy water churned and sucked at Ada's boots, pulling her down. She cried out as her footing gave way. But Talon was there. He had braced himself against a gnarled root system. He held her wrist with one hand, his muscles straining, his face a mask of fierce concentration. The pull of the flood was immense, a greedy, liquid hand trying to claim her. "Do not look down," he commanded, his voice a raw shout. "Look at me! Climb!" His strength was a lifeline, focusing on his face, on the absolute certainty in his eyes. She found a new reserve of strength. She dug her fingers into the mud, found a foothold, and pulled. He hauled her upward, their movements frantic and desperate. They reached the top of the bank just as the crest of the flood wave smashed against it, sending a spray of muddy water over them. They collapsed onto the scrubby, wind-swept ground, soaked, gasping for air, their bodies trembling with adrenaline and exertion. The flash flood raged below them, a temporary, violent river filling the wash from bank to bank. They had escaped by seconds. For a long time, they just lay there, listening to the roar of the water and the drumming of their own hearts. The rain began to lessen, the wind died down, and the dust-choked air was washed clean. A strange, serene quiet settled over the land, the quiet that follows a battle. Ada pushed herself into a sitting position. She was covered in mud. Her dress was torn, and she was shaking uncontrollably, but she was alive. She looked at Talon. He was watching the water, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse. It was an inadequate phrase for what he had just done. He had not just saved her. He had anchored her when the world was being washed away. He turned to look at her, and in his eyes, she saw not the hard, watchful warrior, but something else, a shared vulnerability, a recognition of the fragile thread that connected them. He simply nodded, the gesture carrying more weight than any words. As the last of the storm clouds moved eastward, a final, distant flash of lightning silently illuminated the horizon, and against that pale flicker, they both saw him. On the bluff on the far side of the wash, the one they had been heading for, was a lone rider, He was looking down at the second plume of smoke rising from red rock, a dark shape against the clearing sky. Ada's journalistic instincts, forged in fire and now tempered by flood, took over. The terror and exhaustion fell away, replaced by a singular, sharp focus. "My camera," she said, scrambling for the heavy leather case she had somehow managed to keep hold of. The rider was far away, and the light was fading fast. It was a nearly impossible shot. She fumbled with the tripod, her hands clumsy and slick with mud. Talon, understanding instantly, moved to help her, his steady hands securing the legs, anchoring them to the wet ground. She worked with a desperate haste, pulling the camera out, draping the dark cloth over her head, her world narrowing to the small, upside-down image on the ground glass. The rider was a blurry figure, but there was a detail that snagged her eye, made sharp by her focused intent: the horse's bridle. It was not a simple leather strap. It had a complex, boxy piece of ironwork around the horse's nose and jaw. A frame bridle, a heavy, specialized piece of tack used on draft animals, the kind that pulled railroad carts. It was another signature, as clear to her as the horseshoe had been. "Hold it steady," she whispered, more to herself than to Talon. She slid the glass plate into the camera. The rider was turning to leave. She had only a moment. She uncapped the lens. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She held it open a second longer, praying for enough light. A final, faint flicker of lightning provided it, a gift from the storm. She snapped the cap back on. She pulled the plate holder out, her hands shaking so much she was afraid she would drop it. She did not know if she had captured anything at all. It might be nothing but a blur, a smudge of gray on black, but it might be everything. She looked up from the camera. The rider was gone. Below, the floodwaters were already beginning to recede, leaving behind a raw, scoured landscape. In the distance, the smoke from Red Rock continued its slow, inexorable climb into the evening sky. They had survived the fury of the land, only to be reminded of the far more patient and deliberate malice of men. The journey back to the outskirts of Red Rock was a tense, silent affair. The scoured landscape of Dead Man's Wash was a raw wound on the earth, a testament to the power they had barely survived. Each step was a conscious effort, a fight against the trembling exhaustion in Ada's limbs. Talon moved beside her, a steady, watchful presence, his earlier silence now feeling less like distance and more like a shared understanding that transcended words. He had seen her fear, but he had also seen her stand her ground, her hands steady on her camera while the world fell apart. They did not risk entering the town proper. Instead, Talon led her through a maze of back alleys and shadowed corrals to the rear of the blacksmith's forge. The heavy scent of coal smoke and horse hung in the air, a strangely comforting anchor in the chaotic aftermath of the storm. A low light burned in a back window. Talon gave a soft, distinct knock, a pattern of 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. The door opened a crack, and a man's weary face appeared in the gap. He was of middle age, with a strong, handsome face of Spanish and Mexican heritage, his brow perpetually furrowed with a quiet worry. He saw Talon and his expression relaxed into one of profound relief. He opened the door wider, his eyes falling on Ada, muddy and disheveled. "Talon, we heard the flood. I feared—" He did not finish, just shook his head and gestured them inside. Come in, come in. The whole town is in an uproar." This was Miguel Ortega. His forge was a hub of information, a place where ranchers, prospectors, and townsfolk all came. And Miguel had a gift for listening more than he spoke. The main room of the forge was a cavern of shadows, dominated by the massive, sleeping anvil and the cold, brick heart of the forge itself. He led them into a small, cluttered room at the back where he lived, clearing a space for them at a small wooden table. "Another fire," Miguel said, pouring them each a cup of strong, hot coffee. "The general store this time." Pike and his vigilantes were all over town, shouting about Navajo tracks found in the mud. They are stirring the pot, making it boil. The tracks were not thine, Talon said, his voice flat and hard. Ada placed her precious camera case on the table, her hands moving with reverent care. I need a place with no light. Miguel, as dark as you can make it. And water? I have to develop a plate. Miguel looked from Ada's fiercely determined face to Talon's grim one and asked no questions. He led her to a small, windowless storeroom used for keeping coal. It was perfect. While Talon stood guard outside the main door, a silent sentinel watching the alley. Ada and Miguel worked. They hung blankets over the doorframe, plugging every conceivable crack of light. In the suffocating, absolute darkness, Ada set up her small chemical bath. The air grew thick with the sharp, ether-like smell of collodion. Working by the dim, safe glow of a single red lantern, she submerged the glass plate. The tension in the small room was so thick she could feel it on her skin. This plate held everything. It was the fruit of survival, a fragile piece of glass that could either condemn her as a fool or arm her as a truth-teller. She rocked the tray gently, her eyes fixed on the milky surface, slowly, agonizingly. An image began to emerge from the ether, a ghost of a scene resolving itself in the chemical bath. It was blurry. The light had been too poor, her hands too unsteady, but it was there, the unmistakable silhouette of a man on a horse, with the dark plume of smoke in the background. And on the horse's head, faint but definite, was the boxy, angular shape of the iron frame bridle. There, she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of relief and terror. There it is. Miguel leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. I have seen that bridle. Fowler. The rancher Creed bought out. He used them on his big draft horses for hauling equipment. No one else around here has them. It was the link, another piece of the chain connecting the railroad to the violence. She washed and fixed the plate, her hands moving with a newfound certainty. The image was weak, but the truth it held was strong. Later that night, after Ada had cleaned herself up as best she could and eaten the simple meal of beans and bread Miguel provided, the blacksmith approached her. He had been quiet and pensive all evening, his gaze distant. He held a folded piece of paper in his hand. There is something else you must see, he said, his voice low. He unfolded the paper and laid it on the table. It was a letter, or rather, a copy of one, transcribed in Miguel's neat, careful hand. One of Pike's deputies, Miguel explained. A young man. He brought a letter to me to be sent with the mail pouch. He was careless. He left the original on my counter while he went to the saloon. I thought it might be important. My wife. She reads and writes English better than I. She copied it before I returned it to the boy. Ada picked up the paper. The words were a death sentence for the din and a railroad contract for Silas Creed. The language was direct, stripped of all pretense, the cold calculus of power. To Sheriff A. Pike. The letter read, The territorial land survey is scheduled in 2 months. It is imperative that the Red Rock territories are deemed unsettled and hostile. You will continue to escalate your efforts to push the tribe out of the canyons before the surveyors arrive. Success will ensure the finalization of the Creed and Company Railroad contract and your bonus. Fail, and you will find yourself on the wrong side of a jail cell. It was signed S. Creed. Below the signature, Miguel's wife had drawn a small circle, and within it, a sketch of a crossed pickaxe and shovel. The original, Miguel said, his voice barely a whisper. It was sealed with a blob of red wax, stamped with his signet, like a drop of blood on the page. Ada felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. This was it. Not a clue, not a hint, but a direct order. A conspiracy laid bare in black and white. She had a blurry photograph, and now, the text of a letter that ordered what amounted to a private war. What can we do with this? She asked, looking from the letter to Talon, who had read it over her shoulder. his face unmoving but his eyes burning with a cold fire. Pike is the law here. He will just destroy it, like he did my first plate. Pike is not the only law, Miguel said, his gaze steady. There is Judge Eamon O'Rourke, the circuit judge. He is a hard man, an old man, but they say he is fair. He travels the territory, holding court wherever it is needed. He is due in the next county in a few weeks. He may pass through here. Hope, a fragile, dangerous thing, began to bloom in Ada's chest. A real judge, a representative of a law that might not be for sale. We have to get this to him. This letter, my photograph. A piece of paper and a blurry picture, Talon interjected, his voice cutting through her rising excitement. Creed will say the letter is a forgery. Pike will say the picture shows nothing. You need more. You need a witness who will speak what they know in the judge's court. He was right. Their evidence was powerful, but it was silent. It needed a human voice to give it life, to swear to its truth under oath. But who in Red Rock would dare to stand against Creed and Pike? The vigilantes were growing bolder, strutting through the town like an occupying army, and fear was a currency more common than silver. The answer came 2 nights later, in the form of a nervous, shuffling figure in a dark alley. Ada had been returning to the forge after a clandestine trip to her old boarding house to retrieve more of her supplies. A young man stepped out of the shadows, his deputy's badge catching a faint sliver of moonlight. It was Caleb Boone, a boy no older than 19, with a face that had not yet hardened to the cruelty of his profession. He looked terrified. "Ma'am?" he stammered, twisting his hat in his hands. "Miss McCrae, I cannot do it. I cannot be a part of it." Ada stood perfectly still, her heart beginning to pound. "The fire at the general store," Caleb whispered, his words rushing out in a torrent. "Sheriff Pike, he told us to let it burn for a while, to make a good show of it. He had one of Creed's men set it. I saw him, and afterward, he told us to write in the log that we were on patrol out by the old mission. But we were not. We were right here in town, watching." The boy's conscience was at war with his fear. He was cracking. "Why are you telling me this?" Ada asked, her voice soft, not wanting to spook him. "Because it is wrong," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of conviction. "My father was a lawman. He believed in protecting people. Pike, he only protects Creed's money." He took a deep breath. "I cannot speak out. Not yet. Pike would kill me. But you are trying to find the truth. I want to help." He pushed a folded piece of paper into her hand. "These are the patrol schedules for the next week, the ones in the official log. They are all lies. He is keeping his men close to town, ready to make more trouble. The routes he claims to be patrolling, they will be empty. It is not much, but it might keep you safe. It might give you a chance to move without being seen." He then turned and hurried away, melting back into the shadows, a boy playing a man's game with deadly stakes. Ada returned to the forge, her mind reeling. She held Caleb's note in one hand and the copy of Creed's letter in the other. She had the method, the motive, and now, a small but crucial crack in the wall of silence that surrounded the sheriff's office. She had the courage of a blacksmith and the guilty conscience of a young deputy. It was not an army, but it was a start. The law was coming, in the form of an old judge in a dusty coat. Her task now was simple and impossible: to stay alive, and to hold on to the truth, until he arrived. The information from Caleb Boone was a key, but it was a key to a maze filled with traps. Red Rock had become a cage. Every corner seemed to hold a watchful pair of eyes. Every friendly nod from a townsperson felt like a potential betrayal. Miguel Ortega's forge, once a sanctuary, now felt like the center of a spider's web. They could not stay. Using the falsified patrol schedule, Talon found a window in the web of surveillance. In the dead of night, when the town was sunk in a drunken, exhausted sleep, and Pike's men were deliberately patrolling the wrong roads, he led Ada out. Their destination was a high, flat-topped mountain that dominated the southern horizon. a landmass of dark rock and stubborn juniper the locals called the Green Mesa. The climb was arduous, a test of will and muscle. They followed game trails that were little more than suggestions of a path, their way lit only by the cold, distant light of the stars. The higher they climbed, the more the world below seemed to shrink, the troubles of red rock becoming a small, insignificant cluster of flickering lights. The air grew thin and clean, scented with pine and dust, and the silence was profound, broken only by the sound of their own labored breathing and the cry of a hunting owl. They found shelter in a shallow cave carved by wind and time from the cliff face, a protected alcove that offered a commanding view of the entire valley. From this vantage point, the town was a festering splinter in the vast, serene landscape. They were exposed, yet they were freer than they had been in days. Here, the rules of Pike and Creed did not apply. The only laws were those of survival, of sun and wind and gravity. They made a small, smokeless fire deep in the cave, its light pushing back the oppressive darkness. For 2 days, they lived a spare, elemental existence. Talon would disappear for hours, returning with a brace of rabbits or a handful of edible roots. Ada spent her time cleaning her precious camera equipment, maintaining the tools of her trade, her one weapon against the lies below. The forced proximity, the shared danger, and the immense, isolating silence began to wear away the protective layers they both held so tightly. On the second night, as they sat by the fire, the vast, star-dusted canopy of the sky their only roof, the quiet between them became a space for confession. "My husband, his name was Thomas," Ada said, her voice soft, the words seeming to be pulled from a deep, long-sealed well. She stared into the flames, her eyes seeing a different time, a different place. He was a journalist, a man who loved words more than anything. He believed they could build a better world. "We were in New Orleans. The fever came in on a ship. They said it moved through the city like a hot, yellow fog. One day he was writing an article about dock worker wages, and the next, he was burning with a fire I could not put out." She paused, wrapping her arms around her knees. "I nursed him for a week. The things a body can do, the ways it can betray you. I watched it all. And then he was gone. I felt hollowed out, powerless. Everything we had built, everything he believed in, just vanished. This camera," she said, gesturing to the heavy wooden box that sat like a shrine in the corner of the cave. "It was his idea. He bought it for me. He said I had an eye for things people missed, after he died. It was all I had left of that dream. When I look through that lens, I can make the world hold still. I can capture a moment, just one, and freeze it before it can be stolen from me. That is why I could not run. Pike stole a moment of truth from me, and I will not let him keep it." Talon listened without interruption, his face a study in shadows. The firelight played across the hard lines of his jaw, the quiet intensity in his eyes. When she finished, a long silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of burning juniper. "I was a scout, once," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "For the army." He did not look at her, but at the glowing embers. "I was young. I thought it was a way to protect my people, to understand the white man's world from the inside, to be a bridge between two worlds. My eyes are good. I can track a single man across bare rock. I can read the meaning of a broken twig. The soldiers, they valued that. They used me to hunt the Apache." He fell silent again, the memory a heavy weight. "The Apache fought to keep their land, my people, the Dine. We had fought for hours. We were not so different, but I wore the army's blue coat and I took their silver dollars. I led them to camps where there were women and children. I told myself it was war. I told myself I was a soldier, following orders. Then I watched what they did after the fighting was done. I saw a captain, a man I respected, promise a band of Chiricahua safe passage, and then I watched his men open fire when their backs were turned." His hands clenched into fists on his knees. It was the long walk all over again. A different tribe, a different winter, but the same lie. You see, the white man's words are not like our words. They can be bent, they can be broken. My own eyes, my own skills were being used to help a liar. I left. I came back to the canyons, but some of my people, they looked at me and saw the blue coat. They saw a man who had taken the army's money to hunt other natives. They did not see the shame I carried. I left one community, and I was not sure I still belonged to my own. So I watch, and I train horses, and I wait. I wait for a chance to use my eyes for my own people, for the truth, not for a liar's silver. In the flickering light of the small fire, they saw each other for the first time, not as a white woman and a Navajo warrior, but as two people marked by loss and betrayal, each searching for a way to reclaim a piece of their stolen soul. A bond, fragile but strong, was forged in the shared darkness. The attack came without warning. A shout from the darkness below, the sharp crack of a rifle, and a bullet ricocheted off the rock face near the mouth of the cave, sending stone chips flying. The vigilantes, someone had found their trail. Talon moved with explosive speed, kicking dirt over the fire, plunging the cave into absolute blackness. "They will not come up the way we did," he hissed, his voice urgent in the dark. "They will try to trap us. Grab your things. We go now." Another shot rang out, closer this time. Ada's heart leaped into her throat. She fumbled for her camera and her satchel, her hands shaking. Talon was already at the back of the shallow cave, pulling at a section of rock that looked no different from the rest of the wall. With a low grate, a large, flat stone swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow opening. "There are other paths on this mesa," he said, pulling her toward the opening. The passage was a tight squeeze, a claustrophobic tunnel through the heart of the mountain. It led them to the far side of the mesa, to the edge of a sheer cliff that dropped hundreds of feet into the canyon below. The shouts of the vigilantes were closing in, their torchlight painting wild, dancing patterns against the rocks above. They were trapped. "Here," Talon said, his voice calm despite the approaching danger. He knelt and pulled a thick coil of rope from a hidden crevice. It was made of plaited yucca fiber, strong and weathered. He anchored it to a thick, gnarled root that grew from the cliff edge. "This is the way down." Ada looked over the edge into the terrifying, absolute blackness of the abyss. Vertigo seized her, a dizzying wave of nausea. "I cannot," she gasped. Talon took her by the shoulders, his grip firm, forcing her to look at him. "Yes, you can," he said, his voice a low, commanding force that cut through her panic. "You have seen your husband die. You have faced down a flash flood. This is just rock and air. I will be below you. I will not let you fall. You must trust me." He was not asking. He was telling her. In his eyes, she saw the same absolute certainty she had seen when he pulled her from the floodwaters. It was an anchor in the swirling chaos. She nodded, her throat too tight for words. He went first, disappearing over the edge with the fluid grace of a lizard, his movements sure and swift in the darkness. Then it was her turn. She gripped the rough, fibrous rope, her knuckles white, and swung her legs over the edge. For a terrifying moment, she dangled over the void, her boots scrabbling for a foothold on the vertical rock face. "I am here," Talon's voice came from just below her. "I have you." Slowly, hand over hand, foot by foot, she began to descend. The rock scraped her skin. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she did not look down. She focused only on the rope in her hands and the sound of his voice, a steady, calm presence in the vast, empty darkness. They reached the bottom, a narrow ledge 50 feet from the canyon floor, just as torches appeared at the top of the cliff. They were out of rifle range, hidden by the overhang. They had made it. They sank to the ground, their bodies trembling, their lungs burning. They were alive. They were free, but they were fugitives. As they caught their breath, the gravity of their situation settled upon them. They were hunted. They had allies. but they were few and scattered. Their enemies controlled the town, the law, and the guns. Ada looked at Talon, his face etched with exhaustion in the faint starlight. "If something happens to me," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "if they catch me, you have to get the evidence to the judge. The copy of the letter. What you know. You must not stop." Talon met her gaze, his eyes dark and serious. "The same is true for you," he replied, his voice equally steady. "If they find me, you do not come back. You find Judge O'Rourke. You tell him what you have seen. You show him your pictures. The truth is more important than my life, or yours. You must promise me." On that narrow ledge, suspended between the hunter's moon and the hard, unforgiving earth, they made their vow. It was not a promise of victory, but of endurance. A promise that if one of them fell, the other would carry their shared truth forward. A single flickering flame against an overwhelming darkness. The flight from Green Mesa was a descent into a labyrinth of stone and shadow. They moved for the remainder of the night and all through the next day, a relentless, punishing journey that took them deeper into the territory's wild, untracked heart. Thirst became a constant companion, a dry, rasping presence in the back of Ada's throat. Her city boots, never intended for such a trial, were scraped and torn. Her feet, a geography of blisters and bruises. Talon seemed immune to the hardship, a part of the landscape itself, his movements economical, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain, reading a language of stone and scrub that was invisible to her. They were following a barely there trail along the rim of a deep, winding arroyo. Late in the afternoon, a child's cry, thin and desperate, echoed up from the canyon floor. It was a sound of pure distress that cut through their exhaustion. Talon was over the edge in an instant, moving down the steep, crumbling slope with a speed that defied gravity. Ada, her heart lurching, followed as quickly as she could, her weariness forgotten in the face of the small, terrified sound. A Dine boy, no more than 7 or 8, had been trying to retrieve a stray lamb from a narrow cleft in the rocks and had gotten himself wedged tight. His family was nowhere in sight, likely part of a small group moving their flock to new pastures, while Talon worked to calm the child, speaking in the soft, melodic tones of their shared tongue. Ada scrambled down to a lower ledge to approach the trapped lamb from below, hoping to coax it upward and give the boy more room to free himself. The ledge was unstable. As she reached for the frightened animal, the rock beneath her boot gave way. She cried out, not in fear but in surprise. As she fell, it was not a long drop, only a few feet, but she landed hard against the unyielding wall of the arroyo. A sickening, grinding pain exploded in her left shoulder. The world went white for a moment, then came rushing back in a wave of nausea and a deep, agonizing throb. She had felt this kind of pain once before, when a runaway horse had knocked her against a fence post as a girl. Her shoulder was out of its socket. Talon had the boy free. He sent him on his way with a gentle push and a word of instruction, the child and his lamb scrambling up the far side of the arroyo toward the open mesa. Then he was at Ada's side, his face a mask of controlled concern. One look at the unnatural angle of her arm, at the white-knuckled grip of her right hand on her own shoulder. And he knew. "We cannot stay here," he said, his voice low and firm. "Can you walk?" She nodded, biting her lip against a fresh wave of pain. Every jostle, every step, was a fresh torment. But they were exposed here. The vigilantes could be anywhere. She pushed herself to her feet, a low gasp escaping her lips. Talon guided her, his hand a steady, warm pressure on her good side, half supporting her as they moved. He led her not back the way they had come, but deeper into a network of smaller, intersecting canyons, just as the sun was bleeding its last colors across the horizon. He found what he was looking for, a small, temporary shelter. A lean-to made of hide stretched over a frame of juniper branches, nearly invisible against the rock wall behind it. It was a hunter's camp, long abandoned. As if on cue, the sky, which had been clear and vast, began to cloud over. A cold wind snaked its way down the canyon, carrying the scent of rain. By the time they were huddled inside the small, dark space, the first drops were beginning to fall, pattering softly on the taut hide roof. The shelter was barely large enough for two. Talon used his flint and steel to coax a tiny, flickering flame from a pile of dry tinder he found in a protected corner. The fire pushed back the chill and the encroaching darkness, filling the small space with a welcome, dancing light. He then pulled a small, dried bundle of sage from a pouch at his belt and placed it near the fire. A clean, sharp, purifying scent slowly filled the air, mingling with the smell of old leather and rain-soaked earth. Ada sat huddled in her cloak, shivering, though not entirely from the cold. The pain in her shoulder was a constant, grinding presence, a hot, angry center from which waves of sickness radiated. Talon let her rest for a time, watching her in the firelight. The ordeal had stripped away all pretense. Her face was smudged with dirt. Her hair was a tangled mess, and her eyes were wide with a pain she was trying desperately to hide. He saw not the Eastern lady photographer, but the woman who had faced down a flash flood to capture a blurry image of the truth, the woman who had climbed down a sheer cliff in the dark. "I must fix it," he said quietly, his voice a calm certainty in the small, rain-swept world of the shelter. Ada looked at him, her fear and trust warring in her eyes. "You know how. My grandfather taught his sons, and they taught me. He said, 'It is not a thing of medicine bags and chance. It is a thing of the hands, of knowing where the bone wishes to go, but it will hurt.'" She took a deep, shuddering breath and nodded. "Do it." The simple consent was a profound act of trust. He moved closer, the small space shrinking until the warmth from his body was a tangible presence. He had her sit up straight, her back against his legs for support. His instructions were soft, clear. "Breathe. Do not fight it. Let the breath out when I move." His hands were gentle as he probed the injured joint. His fingers were long and calloused, the hands of a man who worked with horses and ropes, but his touch was surprisingly delicate, knowledgeable. He traced the line of her collarbone, the curve of her shoulder blade, learning the landscape of her pain. She flinched, a sharp intake of breath. "Easy," he murmured, his voice close to her ear. "I am just finding the way." He repositioned his hands, one gripping her arm just above the elbow, the other finding a specific spot on her shoulder, his thumb pressing deep into the muscle. The pressure was a new kind of pain, sharp and focused, yet somehow different from the dull, grinding ache of the dislocation. It was a pain with a purpose. He had her relax, then tense the muscle, then relax again, his hands moving with her, guiding her. He was not fighting her body, he was working with it. He found the precise point, a knot of muscle and displaced bone. He shifted his grip slightly, his thumb pressing down with a firm, unwavering pressure. A jolt, half pain, half relief shot through her. It was an epicenter, the very heart of her injury. An involuntary sound, a strangled cry, was torn from her throat. "Oh God, right there!" A low, soft chuckle rumbled in his chest, a sound of reassurance. "I found you," he whispered, his voice a deep, quiet current beneath the sound of the rain. And then he moved. It was not a violent yank, but a swift, practiced rotation, a pull and a turn all in one fluid motion. His fingers pressed like western thunder, a powerful, resonant force that was over in an instant. There was a sickening, wet pop as the head of the humerus slipped back into its socket. The sudden, sharp agony made her cry out again, but it was immediately followed by a wave of relief so profound it left her dizzy. The grinding, disabling pain was gone, replaced by a deep, throbbing ache that was almost a pleasure by comparison. She slumped against him, her body boneless, her breath coming in ragged. grateful sobs. He held her for a moment, letting the shudders pass, his hand still resting on her shoulder, no longer as a healer, but as a comfort. The warmth of his touch spread through her, chasing away the last of the cold shock. The rain drummed a steady, hypnotic rhythm on the hide roof. The fire crackled, casting their mingled shadows against the leather walls. She slowly lifted her head. Her face was inches from his. The firelight played in the depths of his dark eyes, and in them she saw not a warrior, not a scout, not a healer, but simply a man. The barriers they had so carefully maintained, the necessary distance of two worlds colliding, had been washed away by flood and fire, and finally, by this single, profound act of trust and healing. The air in the shelter grew thick, charged with an unspoken truth that had been building since the day he had pulled her from the flood. The raw, elemental connection they had forged in shared danger and whispered confessions now coalesced into a quiet, undeniable longing. He did not move, leaving the choice to her. Slowly, she raised her good hand and touched his face, her fingers tracing the hard line of his jaw. It was a gesture of immense tenderness, of gratitude, and of acceptance. He closed his eyes for a moment, leaning into her touch. When he opened them again, the last of his reserve was gone. He lowered his head, and in the quiet of the rain-swept world, his lips met hers. It was a kiss that held no desperation, no frantic passion, but a deep, slow-burning recognition. A homecoming for two souls who had been wandering in the wilderness of their own grief. It was a taste of rain and smoke and sage, the very essence of the land that had brought them together. The world outside, with its vigilantes and its railroad barons, its lies and its violence, ceased to exist. There was only the sound of the rain, the warmth of the fire, and the steady, certain beat of two hearts that had finally found their rhythm in the darkness. When they parted, the dawn was a pale gray promise in the east. The rain had stopped. The world was washed clean, quiet, and new. They lay side by side under his blanket, the warmth of the small fire a dwindling comfort against the morning chill. The intimacy of the night had not solved their problems. It had, in fact, complicated them. "Ada," he said, his voice soft in the stillness. "I know," she answered, not needing him to say more. "The promise we made on the mesa," he continued, his gaze serious, "it still stands. Judge O'Rourke is still coming. Creed is still waiting." "I know," she said again, her voice stronger this time. She sat up, wincing as she moved her sore shoulder. But the movement was her own again. "What happened here? It does not change that. It cannot. The truth we are fighting for is bigger than we are." He nodded, a quiet respect in his eyes. What they had found in the shelter was a sanctuary. A moment of grace stolen from the heart of a storm. But it was not an escape. Their love, if that is what it was to become, could not be a soft place to hide. It had to be a fortress, another source of strength for the hard road that still lay ahead. They were partners, bound by a vow to seek justice, and now, by something deeper, a shared hope for a future they had to fight for. They rose and left the shelter, stepping out into the clean, cold air of the new day. Together. The return to Red Rock was a journey into the enemy's camp. They moved only at night, guided by Talon's deep knowledge of the land and Caleb Boone's stolen schedule. Each shadow was a potential threat, each gust of wind a possible warning. The intimacy born in the hunter's shelter did not soften their reality. It sharpened it. The stakes were no longer just about a principle of justice. They were deeply, terrifyingly personal. They found refuge once more in the stifling heat and metallic air of Miguel Ortega's forge. The blacksmith welcomed them with a grim, worried look, his questions held back by the urgent, haunted look in their eyes. Their first priority was the single, precious glass plate from Dead Man's Wash. During her fall in the arroyo, the heavy camera case had taken a hard impact, and Ada's deepest fear was that the plate, her only visual proof, had been shattered. In the absolute darkness of the coal shed, she opened the plate holder with trembling hands. A low, frustrated sigh escaped her lips. It was not shattered, but a thin, sharp crack ran like a lightning bolt across the glass, a spider web of smaller fractures radiating from the point of impact. It was damaged, perhaps ruined. "Let me see," Miguel said, his voice a steady presence in the dark. By the dim red light of the safety lantern, they examined the negative. The crack ran directly through the center of the image, bisecting the silhouette of the rider. It was a cruel stroke of fate. "I might not be able to make a print," Ada said, her voice hollow with defeat. "The light will bleed through the crack. The image will be ruined." For a full day, she was consumed by a quiet despair. The plate sat on a shelf, a monument to their failure. Talon watched her, his silence a sign of shared frustration, not of judgment. He spent the day on the roof of the forge, a motionless lookout, his eyes scanning the dusty streets for any sign of Pike or his vigilantes. It was Miguel who offered a sliver of hope. He was a man who worked with broken things, a man who knew how to join pieces of iron with fire and force. He looked at the problem not as a photographer, but as a craftsman. "The glass is broken," he said, turning the plate over in his calloused hands. "But the image, the silver on the surface, is still there. If you could hold the pieces together perfectly flat, could you not make one clear picture?" His simple logic sparked an idea in Ada's mind. It was a desperate, unconventional solution. She needed to make a contact print, pressing the negative directly against the photographic paper. To do that, she needed to hold the cracked pieces in perfect alignment and apply even pressure. She needed a temporary frame, a perfectly flat surface. She described what she needed to Miguel: a small, thin sheet of metal, polished to a mirror finish, to reflect the light back evenly and provide a rigid backing, a frame of dark wood to hold the fractured glass and the paper in a tight sandwich. For 2 days, the forge came to life with a new purpose. The clang of Miguel's hammer was not for horseshoes or wagon wheels, but for the delicate, precise work of crafting a tool to save a fractured truth. He worked with a quiet, intense focus, hammering, filing, and polishing a piece of tin until it shone like a lady's hand mirror. While he worked, Ada prepared her chemicals, her despair replaced by a fragile, nervous energy. She coated the albumin paper, the scent of silver nitrate sharp and clean in the hot, dry air. Finally, the frame was ready. In the red gloom of the dark room, they performed their delicate surgery. They placed the cracked negative on the polished tin, carefully fitting the pieces together like a puzzle. The spider web of fractures was still visible, a scar on the image. They laid the sensitized paper on top, then the wooden frame, and clamped it all together. They took the printing frame to the roof, where the sun was a relentless, white-hot eye in the sky. They set it in the direct light, a small, hopeful offering to the heavens. "How long?" Talon asked, joining them on the roof, his presence a silent guard. "I do not know," Ada confessed. "With the weak image, the cracked glass, it could take an hour. It could take all afternoon." They waited. The sun beat down, the heat shimmering off the dusty rooftops. The sounds of red rock drifted up to them, the rumble of a wagon, the distant shouts of men, the nervous whinny of a horse. Each sound was a potential threat. They were completely exposed. Finally, judging by the change in color on a test strip of paper, Ada decided it was time. They took the frame back down to the darkness of the coal shed. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she carefully unclasped the frame and separated the paper from the glass. She slipped the exposed paper into the developing bath, her hands shaking. The image that emerged was a miracle of chemistry and will. It was ghostly and faint, scarred by the web of thin white lines where the glass was cracked. But it was there, and it was clear enough. The man on the horse wore a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat. A red scarf was a dark smudge covering the lower half of his face, but the face itself, from the eyes up, was visible. hard, deep-set eyes, a low, thick brow, and a distinctive scar that cut through his left eyebrow, and on his horse, the boxy, unmistakable shape of the railroad frame bridle. "Jedediah Stone," Miguel breathed, his voice a hoarse whisper. "He is the foreman at Creed's silver mine, a hard man, harder than any rock he pulls from the ground." They had a face, they had a name. The anonymous rider in the red scarf was no longer a phantom. He was an employee of Silas Creed. The victory was short-lived. Their small success seemed to stir the hornet's nest. Pike and his vigilantes grew more aggressive, their presence in the town more oppressive. They questioned everyone, their eyes lingering on Miguel's forge. The town was dividing, the fault lines of fear and loyalty cracking open. Some people spat on the ground when the vigilantes passed, their faces tight with resentment. Others offered them drinks in the saloon, eager to be on the winning side. A few days later, a message came from Caleb Boone. It was delivered by a young boy who brought a broken shovel to be mended. The note tucked inside a split in the wooden handle. The message was simple midnight. The old church. The meeting was fraught with tension. Caleb was a pale, trembling ghost in the moonlight that filtered through the church's grimy windows. He was holding a heavy, leather-bound ledger. "I cannot keep this anymore," he whispered, thrusting the book into Talon's hands. "Pike keeps it in a locked drawer. I took the key from his coat while he was sleeping. He will know it is missing by morning." He was burning his bridges, choosing his side in the most final way possible. Back at the forge, they examined the ledger by the light of a single, hooded lantern. It was a meticulous record of Pike's corruption. Under the heading of informant payments were the names of the most prominent vigilantes. Next to each name was a date and a sum of money. The dates corresponded perfectly with the attack on the wagon train, the fire at the German family's grain store, and the blaze at the general store. It was the missing piece, the cold, hard proof of a conspiracy paid for in cash. They now had a face, a motive, and a payroll. They had enough to see Pike and Creed and Jedediah Stone hang. All they had to do was survive long enough to find Judge O'Rourke. But their luck had run out. The next evening, as dusk was settling over the town, a sudden, violent commotion erupted at the front of the forge. Shouts, the splintering of wood. It was Pike and half a dozen of his men. "They know," Miguel said, his face pale. "Someone talked." Talon did not hesitate. "Ada, get the evidence. Go out the back. Run for the canyons. Do not stop." But it was too late. While Pike and his men were smashing the front of the shop, two other men, their faces ugly with a drunken malice, came around the back. They carried torches. One of them threw his torch onto the roof of the coal shed. The dry wood and tar paper caught instantly. Ada's darkroom, her sanctuary, her armory, went up in a whoosh of greasy, black smoke. "The plates!" she cried, moving toward the burning shed. All her work, her images of the dine, her landscapes, her entire reason for being here, was turning to ash. Talon grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "It is just glass and paper. Your life is more important." The two vigilantes charged them. At the same time, screams came from the front of the forge. They had gotten to Miguel. Talon shoved Ada behind him. He met the charge not with fury, but with a cold, brutal efficiency. He used the first man's momentum against him, sidestepping and sending him crashing headfirst into the forge's brick wall. The second man swung his torch, and Talon ducked under it. A blur of motion. There was a quick, sharp series of sounds, the impact of bone on bone, and the second man collapsed, clutching a shattered wrist. Talon did not wait to see the outcome. He grabbed Ada's hand and pulled her into the chaos of the main street. The fire was drawing a crowd. Pike was there, a look of triumph on his face as he watched the shed burn. He had two of his men holding Miguel, whose face was already bruised and bleeding, a warning to anyone who would dare to help a fugitive. Pike saw them. He shouted, pointing, "There they are." In the confusion, With the crowd scattering and the fire roaring, Talon saw their only chance. He pulled Ada into the narrow gap between the forge and the next building, the same alley where he had first appeared to her. "Go," he commanded. "I will hold them off." But Ada pulled free from his grasp. She ran back, not toward the street, but toward the burning shed. The heat was a solid wall, the smoke a choking poison. She disappeared inside. For a heart-stopping moment, Talon thought she had been consumed by the flames. She reappeared a second later, coughing, her face black with soot, her hair singed. In her hands, she clutched a single, small, cloth-wrapped bundle, the cracked glass plate and the one good print she had made from it. Everything else was gone. Talon did not need another command. He scooped her up, her light weight a surprise in his arms, and ran. He disappeared into the labyrinth of back alleys just as Pike's men reached the mouth of the alley, their pursuit stymied for a few precious seconds by the billowing smoke and their own hesitation. They escaped into the darkness, leaving behind a burning shed, a beaten friend, and a town held hostage by fear. They had lost their sanctuary. Their allies were in danger, and they were once again fugitives with a price on their heads. But clutched in Ada's hand was a single, fractured photograph, a testament that the truth, no matter how broken, still casts a light. News of Judge Eamon O'Rourke's arrival traveled on the wind, a rumor that solidified into fact. He was not coming to Red Rock, a town he likely considered too small and chaotic to warrant a formal session. He was holding court in a larger settlement a day's ride to the north. For Ada and Talon, it was their only chance. A desperate gamble that required them to leave the relative safety of the wilderness and walk directly into the lion's den. They traveled on foot, avoiding the main roads. The precious, cloth-wrapped photograph and the copy of Creed's letter secured in Ada's satchel. The stolen ledger a heavy, dangerous weight in Talon's pack. They found the judge on the road, a solitary, black-clad figure in a dusty buckboard. His face a roadmap of prairie sun and hard decisions. His eyes a startlingly pale, clear blue. They stood in the middle of the road, forcing him to a halt, two desperate fugitives making their appeal. He listened, his expression unchanging, his gaze moving from Ada's earnest, soot-stained face to Talon's stoic one. He examined her cracked photograph, read the copy of the letter, and flipped through the damning pages of the ledger. He was silent for a long time, the only sound the nervous stamp of his horse and the ceaseless whisper of the wind. "The law," he said finally, his voice a dry rasp, "is not a request. It is a demand. I will hold a hearing, but I will hold it in Red Rock. The justice this town is owed will be delivered to its door." The Red Rock Church was not a grand affair. It was a simple, unpainted wooden box with a plain cross on its steeple, a testament to a faith as spare and unadorned as the landscape itself. Judge O'Rourke commandeered it, his authority absolute and unquestioned. He set up his court on the preacher's podium, a stack of law books his only gavel. The pews filled quickly, a tense, divided congregation of townsfolk, ranchers and miners. On one side sat the vigilantes, their faces smug and confident, with Sheriff Pike standing near the front, his arms crossed over his barrel chest. On the other side sat those who had been cowed into silence, their expressions a mixture of fear and a desperate, flickering hope. Miguel Ortega was there, his face a patchwork of fading bruises. Caleb Boone sat near the back, looking pale and sick with nerves. Lena Two Feathers had come with a small group of dine elders, who sat with a quiet, powerful dignity that seemed to fill the simple room. Just as the judge called the hearing to order, the sky outside turned a familiar, sickly yellow. The wind began to moan, a low, mournful sound that grew into a percussive howl. Sand began to hiss against the windows, and the tin roof began to rattle, a sound like 1,000 angry drumming fingers. A full-blown dust storm descended on the church, plunging the room into a gloomy twilight. The air grew thick with grit, and the building groaned under the assault. It felt as if the land itself had come to bear witness, an impartial and furious jury. Judge O'Rourke seemed not to notice. We are here to examine allegations of arson, incitement to violence, and conspiracy against the peace of this territory," he announced, his voice cutting through the din of the storm. "Miss Ada McCrae, you will present your evidence." Ada walked to the front, the single print in her hand. The room was a sea of hostile and hopeful faces. She felt Talon's gaze on her, a steadying force. She held up the photograph, its surface scarred with the white lines of the cracks. "This photograph was taken during the fire at the general store," she began, her voice clear and steady. "It shows the man who, I believe, set that fire. His name is Jedediah Stone. He is the foreman at the Creed & Company silver mine." She pointed to the faint but visible face. "You can see the scar through his eyebrow. And you can see the bridle on his horse. It is a heavy, iron frame bridle, used for draft animals." She then produced a detailed sketch she had made. "This is a drawing of that bridle. And this," she said, holding up a second sketch, "is a drawing of the cavalry-style horseshoes whose prints were found at the site of the wagon train attack. The same kind of shoe found on a colt traded to the dine by a rancher working for Mr. Creed." Pike let out a snort of derisive laughter, but the judge silenced him with a single, glacial look. "Miguel Ortega," the judge called. The blacksmith walked to the front, his posture straight despite his injuries. He looked not at Pike, but at the judge. "I am the only blacksmith in this town," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction born of pain. "I know every horse, every brand, every piece of tack for 50 miles. That frame bridle, it belongs to Creed's mine. I have repaired it myself. And those horseshoes," he continued, his voice dropping, "I did not make them. No one in this territory makes shoes like that. Except for the army farrier, they are not the work of a local man." Next, Lena. 2 feathers came forward. She did not look at the picture. She held up a single, worn moccasin. "My people have walked this land since the time of the great stories. We move with the earth. Our horses' feet are hard. We do not nail iron to them. To do so is to blind them to the feel of the ground. The tracks you found were a lie, told by a man who does not understand the land or the horse." Her calm, simple words held more power than any angry shout. Finally, the judge called for Caleb Boone. The young deputy looked as if he were walking to his own execution. He did not look at Pike, his eyes fixed on the floor. He placed the heavy ledger on the podium. "This is Sheriff Pike's private payment log," Caleb said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it carried in the tense silence. "On the nights of the wagon attack and the 2 fires, it shows payments made to these men." He pointed a trembling finger at the vigilantes. "For, it says, informant services." A low, angry murmur went through the crowd. The vigilantes shifted in their seats, their smugness evaporating into nervous anger. Sheriff Pike's face had become a mask of purple rage. "Lies!" he roared, his voice cracking. "All of it. Lies from a meddling woman, a beaten smith, a savage, and a traitorous boy." He saw the case, his authority, his entire world, crumbling around him. And he did the only thing a cornered animal knows how to do. He attacked with a snarl. He drew his Colt revolver, the metallic click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the church. He pointed it not at the judge, but at Caleb Boone. "You are finished, boy." Time seemed to slow. Ada gasped. But before Pike could pull the trigger, a blur of motion exploded from the side of the room. Talon moved with the silent, deadly speed she had seen him use in the alley. He did not charge Pike. He simply flowed toward him. In 2 swift strides, he was there. One of his hands shot out, deflecting the gun barrel toward the ceiling. His other hand struck Pike's wrist with a sharp, precise blow. The gun clattered to the wooden floor. Before Pike could even react, Talon had him in a hold. One arm twisted behind his back, his face pressed against the rough-hewn wood of a pew. The entire confrontation was over in less than 2 heartbeats. Just as the deputies loyal to the judge moved to secure the struggling sheriff, the church doors burst open. The storm outside howled. throwing a vortex of dust and debris into the room. Framed in the doorway, a silhouette against the raging brown world, stood Silas Creed. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored city suit, a startling vision of wealth and order in the middle of the chaos. He did not seem to notice the wind or the dust. He walked calmly down the aisle, two large armed men flanking him. He looked at the scene, at his sheriff being subdued, at the pale, determined faces of the witnesses, and a small, condescending smile touched his lips. He reached into his coat and pulled out not a weapon, but a thick canvas bag. With a flick of his wrist, he upended it. Gold and silver coins, eagles and dollars, rained down onto the dusty floor, spinning and clattering with a sound that was both obscene and mesmerizing in the house of God. "It seems there has been a misunderstanding," Creed said, his voice a smooth, confident baritone that easily carried over the storm. "A dispute over wages. Perhaps. Let us not trouble the honorable judge with such trivial matters." He kicked a gold coin with the polished toe of his boot toward one of the vigilantes. "This is a generous town, a generous company. There is enough here for everyone to forget any foolish stories they might have heard." It was an act of breathtaking arrogance, an attempt to buy the entire room, the law itself, right in front of the judge. He was demonstrating that his power, the power of money, was greater than any testimony, greater than any fractured photograph. Judge Eamon O'Rourke watched, his pale blue eyes as cold and hard as winter ice. He did not move until the last coin had stopped rolling. He let the silence stretch, thick with the smell of dust and the metallic tang of greed. Then he stood. He did not shout. He did not bang a gavel. He simply spoke, and his quiet voice commanded the absolute attention of every person in the room. "Silas Creed," he said, his gaze pinning the railroad baron in place. "This court is not a marketplace, and the law is not for sale." He pointed a long, bony finger at the struggling sheriff. "Sheriff Pike, you are under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon, witness tampering, and conspiracy. Deputies, remove him." He then turned his gaze to Creed. "As for you, sir, this court has heard compelling testimony and seen evidence, namely a letter you allegedly authored and a ledger of payments. That suggests you have orchestrated a campaign of terror for financial gain. While the direct evidence presented here today is not sufficient for a criminal conviction in this hearing, it is more than enough to act upon. By the authority vested in me by the United States territorial government, I am hereby issuing an injunction. All assets of the Creed and Company Railroad and mining operations within this territory are frozen. A federal marshal will be dispatched to investigate these claims of fraud, incitement, and murder. You, sir, will not leave this territory until that investigation is concluded." For the first time, a crack appeared in Silas Creed's smooth facade. The color drained from his face. His money, his real weapon, lay useless on the floor. He had overplayed his hand, underestimating the one man in the room whose soul was not for sale. The storm raged outside, but inside the small, dusty church, a different kind of storm had just broken. It was not a final victory, but it was justice. Slow, imperfect, but alive and breathing in the heart of the storm. The dust storm that had served as the backdrop for justice died as quickly as it had been born. It left behind a world choked and silent, the air thick with a gritty haze, the sun a pale, sickly wafer in the sky. Judge O'Rourke's deputies led the shackled Sheriff Pike away, his curses and threats swallowed by the thick, still air. Silas Creed, his face a mask of cold fury, was escorted to the town's only hotel, his freedom now a gilded cage, his assets frozen, his power checked. For a moment, a fragile peace settled over Red Rock. The townsfolk, emerging from the church, blinked in the strange light, their faces a mixture of shock, relief, and uncertainty. They had witnessed the law, in the form of a single, unyielding old man, stare down a tyrant, but the tyrant's creatures, the vigilantes, were still among them. They stood in a sullen, angry cluster outside the saloon, their authority stripped away, their humiliation festering, They had been paid to be bullies, and now they were simply thugs without a master. The retribution, when it came, was the desperate, cowardly act of cornered rats. As night fell, 2 new stars bloomed in the darkness, one at the impoverished eastern edge of town, the other a more distant, angry orange glow against the black silhouette of the canyons. They were not stars, they were fires. A cry of alarm went up. The first fire was in the collection of shacks and lean-tos where the immigrant miners and laborers lived, a tinderbox of dry wood and tar paper. The second was in the direction of the dine camp. The vigilantes, denied their public power, had resorted to the secret power of the torch, lashing out at the most vulnerable, the very people who had dared to speak against them. Chaos erupted. In the heart of it, Ada and Talon stood near the forge. The choice was immediate, brutal, and clear. "Lena and her people are trapped," Talon said, his eyes already fixed on the distant blaze. "They will be the first targets." His purpose was clear: to save lives. "The evidence," Ada said, her voice tight with urgency. "The ledger, the letter, the plate. It is all at Miguel's. It is the only thing keeping Creed from walking away from this. They will burn it all to destroy the proof." Her purpose was equally clear: to save the truth. They looked at each other in the flickering, hellish light. There was no time for argument. A profound, unspoken trust passed between them, the same trust that had seen them down a cliff face in the dark. "Go," she said. "I will handle the evidence." He gave a single sharp nod, squeezed her arm, and then he was gone, a phantom melting into the night, his long, loping stride eating up the ground toward the canyons. Ada turned to find Miguel already rolling a barrel of water toward the shanty town. His face was a grim mask of determination. "They will pay for this," he growled. "First we save what we can," Ada said, her mind racing. "Miguel, the ledger and the letter are in the false bottom of the coal bin. Get them, take them to the church. Bar the door. I will get the photograph." She ran back into the forge, the smoke from the nearby fire already beginning to sting her eyes. She retrieved the cloth-wrapped package containing the cracked plate and the single, precious print. This was the heart of the case, the image that gave a face to the conspiracy. She could not risk it being destroyed. The town was a maelstrom of panic and confusion. People ran aimlessly with buckets, their efforts disorganized and futile. But a strange and terrible thing was happening. The vigilantes, the self-proclaimed protectors of Red Rock, were not fighting the fire. Some were actively hindering the bucket brigades, kicking over barrels of water. Others simply stood and watched, their faces illuminated by the flames, their expressions a mixture of drunken glee and sullen satisfaction. The people of Red Rock began to see. They saw the German family whose grain store had burned, now trying desperately to save their immigrant neighbors. They saw the ranchers who had been intimidated by Pike now forming a line to the town well. And they saw the vigilantes, their true nature revealed in the firelight. After securing the evidence with Miguel, Ada joined the bucket line. The heat was a physical blow, the smoke a choking poison. Embers rained down, singeing her dress and hair. She worked with a frantic, desperate energy, passing bucket after bucket, her mind a numb landscape of heat and smoke and the rhythmic slosh of water. She was no longer a photographer, no longer a journalist. She was just another person fighting to keep the darkness from consuming everything. From the direction of the canyons, Talon, Lena Two Feathers, and a group of dine men and women appeared, moving with a calm, disciplined purpose. They had managed to beat back the fire at their camp, saving their hogans. And now they had come to help the town that had so recently scorned them. Without a word, they joined the bucket brigade, their movements efficient and tireless. The sight of Talon, his face streaked with soot, working side by side with the very townspeople who had feared him, was a powerful, transformative image. Then came the moment that would forever change Red Rock. Caleb Boone, his young face aged with the terrible knowledge of the past weeks, walked into the center of the street. He found the biggest of the vigilantes, a hulking man who was laughing as a shack collapsed in on itself. Caleb did not shout. He simply stood before the man, and with a gesture that was both a renunciation and a declaration, he unpinned the tin star from his shirt. He looked at it for a long moment, then threw it into the red dust at the vigilante's feet. He then turned, walked through the chaotic crowd, and stopped in front of Talon. He extended a hand, calloused and trembling slightly. "Thank you," Caleb said, his voice clear and steady over the roar of the flames. Talon looked at the offered hand, then at the young man's face. He saw not a deputy, not a white man, but simply a man who had chosen to stand for what was right, at great personal cost. He clasped Caleb's hand, a firm, solid grip that sealed a new and unspoken alliance. The town saw it all. And in that handshake, the old order of Red Rock died, and something new, something fragile but real, began to be born. Just as it seemed the fire would leap across the street and consume the center of town, a change came. A cool, damp breeze sighed through the superheated air, and then a drop of water, fat and heavy, hit Ada's cheek, then another and another. It began to rain. It was not the violent, furious deluge of the flash flood. It was a soft, steady, unseasonal rain, a miracle in the arid heart of the territory. The townsfolk stopped their frantic work and turned their faces to the sky, letting the cool, clean water wash the soot and sweat from their skin. The rain fell on the burning shacks, and the roaring flames hissed, sputtered, and died, surrendering to the gentle, persistent grace of the water. The thick, black smoke turned to clean, white steam that rose to the heavens like a prayer. From the church at the end of the street, a new sound began, the slow, steady ringing of the bell. Someone, perhaps the preacher, perhaps Miguel, was not ringing an alarm. It was a call to gather, a summons to the community to come together in the aftermath, to witness the cleansing. The night of fire was over. The dawn came, gray and wet. The eastern edge of town was a ruin of blackened, steaming timbers, but the heart of Red Rock had been saved, not by its appointed guardians, but by a coalition of outcasts, fugitives, and a young man who had found his conscience. In the quiet, rain-soaked morning, Ada did not sleep. She found an inkwell and a stack of paper at the preacher's desk in the now silent church, while the town began the slow, painful work of tending to the burned and the displaced. She wrote. The words poured out of her, fueled by adrenaline and a fierce, clarifying anger. She did not write a simple report of a fire. She wrote the story of a town's soul. She wrote of Miguel's courage, of Lena's dignity, of Caleb's transformation, and of Talon's quiet, unwavering strength. She wrote of the vigilantes' cowardice and Creed's cold, calculated greed. She wrote of a fractured photograph and a ledger of lies, of a brave judge and a cleansing rain. At the top of the first page, she wrote a headline. It was a declaration, a hope, and a promise. Red Rock is no longer red with blood. When the morning stagecoach arrived, its wheels splashing through the muddy street, she handed the thick packet of pages to the driver. "See that this gets to the telegraph office in Prescott," she said, pressing a silver dollar into his hand. "And give copies to every newspaper office between here and St. Louis. It is the most important story you will ever carry." The driver looked at the determined, soot-stained woman, then at the quiet, transformed town around him, and nodded. He understood. He was not just carrying news. He was carrying the birth certificate of a new Red Rock. The weeks that followed the night of fire were a time of slow, painful healing for Red Rock. Ada's story, carried by the telegraph wire, spread like a prairie fire across the territory and beyond. Newspapers in Prescott, Santa Fe, and even as far as Denver picked it up, reprinting her vivid, first-hand account of the conspiracy. Silas Creed's name, once a symbol of progress and power, became synonymous with corruption and greed. The federal marshals who arrived were not the swaggering lawmen of dime novels, but quiet, Methodical accountants and investigators who descended on Creed's office and began to patiently unravel his empire of lies. One fraudulent document at a time. His assets remained frozen. His railroad stalled. A monument to a rich man's hubris. Ex-Sheriff Pike was transported to the territorial prison to await a trial that everyone knew would end in a conviction. The real change, however, happened not in courtrooms, but in the dusty streets of Red Rock itself. In a town meeting held in the repaired church, the people, their voices no longer silenced by fear, made a choice. They did not elect a hard man, a gunslinger, or a politician. They elected Caleb Boone as their new sheriff. He accepted the Tin Star, no longer a symbol of corrupt authority, but a fragile badge of trust, with a humility and gravity that belied his youth. His first official act was to formally shake hands with the dying elders who had come to witness the event, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. For Ada and Talon, the end of the conflict did not bring peace, but a different kind of work. They did not stay in the heart of the town that had nearly destroyed them. Instead, they chose a piece of land on the edge of the open prairie, a place where the last buildings of Red Rock gave way to the vast, wind-swept expanse of grass and sky. It was a place where you could see the sunrise. With their own hands, and with the help of a grateful Miguel Ortega, they built their home. It was not a grand house. It was a long, low structure of adobe and pine, built to withstand the wind, but it was unique. One half of the building was Talon's domain, an open-sided workshop for mending tack and a sturdy corral where he began to gather the lost and mistreated horses of the territory. He had a gift, a quiet way of communicating with the animals, his patience and strength healing the wounds left by cruel hands. The other half was Ada's. It was her dark room, larger and better equipped than the one she had lost. With a proper sink Miguel had fashioned and shelves for her chemicals and glass plates. A single, large window faced north, providing the soft, even light ideal for portraiture. The two halves of the structure were joined in the middle by a small, shared living space with a fireplace and a single, sturdy table. And across the entire front, connecting his world and hers, they built a long, wide porch, a place to sit in the evening and watch the colors change on the distant mesas. Their home was a physical manifestation of their partnership, a testament to the idea that two different lives, two different skills, could be woven together to make a shelter strong enough for the world. One afternoon, as Talon was fitting a new shoe to a rescued mare, Ada emerged from her dark room, her hands smelling of fixer. She was holding a freshly made print, its surface still damp. She had tacked a piece of canvas to the wall of their living space, and now she pinned the new photograph in its center. It was not the cracked, blurry image of Jedediah Stone, which now sat in a federal evidence locker. This was a new picture, taken in the gray, rain-washed dawn after the fire. It showed the smoking ruins of the shantytown, and in the foreground, a line of people, dine and white, immigrant and native-born, passing buckets of water, their faces smudged with soot but united in a common purpose. She had titled it, simply, "The Night Rain That Saved Red Rock." It was a photograph not of a crime, but of a community's redemption. Talon came to stand beside her, his arm resting lightly on her shoulder. He looked at the image for a long time. "You see things other people miss," he said, echoing the words of her late husband, but in his voice, they were a simple statement of fact, a recognition of her unique power. The next day, while Ada was writing letters to the Eastern papers, she heard a strange, new sound, a gentle, metallic music drifting on the breeze. She went out to the porch and saw Talon hanging a new creation from the rafters. He had taken the discarded horseshoes, the symbols of Pike's lies, and forged them into something new. He had heated them in Miguel's forge, twisting and shaping them, and strung them together with strips of cured leather. They were a wind chime. Each gust of wind made them dance, their soft, random clinking a constant, gentle prayer for peace. Every note was a lie transformed into a small piece of music, a reminder that even the tools of deceit could be remade into an instrument of grace. Weeks turned into a season. The harsh heat of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. One clear, cool morning, long before the sun had risen, they rode out together. They did not take the prairie trail, but headed for the high, dark silhouette of the green mesa. They climbed the familiar, difficult path in a comfortable silence, their horses sure-footed in the pre-dawn gloom. They reached the top just as the first hint of color was touching the eastern horizon. They dismounted near the shallow cave that had once been their sanctuary and their prison. The ghosts of that night were still there, the memory of fear and the ricochet of a bullet, but they were only ghosts. The reality was the two of them, standing together, watching the world be born anew. The sun rose, and a wave of golden light washed over the valley, illuminating the small, distant cluster of buildings that was Red Rock, making the red rocks themselves glow as if lit from within. "I have been thinking," Ada said, her voice a soft counterpoint to the vast silence. "The children who lost their homes in the fire, and the dying children. They have seen so much ugliness. I want to show them how to see the beauty. I am going to start a class. Teach them how to use a camera, how to capture the light, both groups, together." Talon looked at her, a slow, proud smile spreading across his face. He understood what she was really saying. It was not about photography. It was about teaching a new generation to see the world and each other with new eyes. "And he said, his gaze sweeping over the vast, dry landscape below, "will build a rescue for the horses. When the dry season comes, many are just turned loose to die. We will bring them here, give them water and feed, a place of refuge." They stood there for a long time, their plans for the future not grand ambitions of wealth or power, but small, sturdy acts of healing and community. Their love was like the home they had built, founded on the bedrock of their work, their shared purpose. It was not a wild, passionate fire that threatened to consume them, but the steady, reliable warmth of a hearth that could see them through a long winter. It was a love for adults, tempered in fire and loss, strong enough to build a life in the wind. As they mounted their horses to ride back down into the light, Ada looked at him, a playful glint in her eye. She reached out and brushed a piece of dust from his collar. "You know," she said, her voice a low tease, "after all of this, do not think you are only good at tracking horses." Talon's smile widened, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He reached out and took her hand, his rough, warm fingers lacing through hers. "I can still find you in a sandstorm," he said. "Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to connect with you. So please comment with where you are listening from. Subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so more people can hear this tale.